What if I told you that a single move by Canada could bring entire US states to their knees? This isn't fiction, it's a real economic threat. Canada is more than just a friendly neighbor. It's one of America's biggest trading partners. And if it suddenly cut ties, some states wouldn't just suffer, they'd collapse. In this video, we're counting down the top 10 US states that would collapse under a Canadian boycott. Number 10. Washington. Washington state is perched on the edge of the Pacific Northwest, making it a vital gateway for international trade, and Canada plays a central role in that ecosystem. In 2024, Washington exported over $7.5 billion worth of goods to Canada, with top products including aerospace components, tech hardware, agricultural produce, and machinery. That figure accounts for more than 20% of all Washington state exports. The Boeing company alone, headquartered in the Seattle area, ships aircraft parts across the Canadian border for assembly, maintenance, and subcontracts. But trade isn't the only link. Over 400 Canadian-owned companies operate in Washington, employing tens of thousands of residents in sectors like tech, energy, and shipping. A Canadian boycott would hit Washington like an economic tsunami. Analysts at the Washington State Department of Commerce estimate a GDP contraction of 2.1%, with potential job losses surpassing 50,000, primarily in aerospace, freight logistics, and agriculture. Major ports like Seattle and Tacoma would see shipping traffic decline sharply, resulting in backlogs and revenue shortfalls. The ripple effect could destabilize everything from real estate to education funding, with a projected $700 million shortfall in tax revenue. In a state already dealing with housing crises and tech sector volatility, a boycott could push Washington into a regional recession. Number 9. Minnesota. Minnesota's economy is much more dependent on Canada than most Americans realize. With Canada being Minnesota's #1 international trading partner, bilateral trade topped $5.8 billion in 2024. The industries most exposed include agriculture, especially grain and livestock, medical devices, iron mining, and food manufacturing. Companies like Cargill and 3M have significant interests in Canadian logistics chains, with thousands of trucks crossing the northern border each week. In fact, nearly 165,000 Minnesota jobs are tied directly or indirectly to trade with Canada. Cities like Duluth rely on cross-border shipping through the Great Lakes and railways to move iron ore and grain to Canadian markets. Now imagine what would happen if Canada closed its border to U.S. trade and imposed a complete economic boycott. Up to 20% of the state's exports would vanish overnight. Farmers would lose access to key export markets, and manufacturers could see production halted due to supply chain disruptions. According to a joint economic report from the Minneapolis Fed and the Minnesota Trade Office, a Canadian boycott could result in a $1.3 billion annual loss, translating to a GDP contraction of 1.7%. The state's unemployment rate could spike by 2.4%. Devastating rural communities and small towns that depend on agriculture and trade. This could trigger a domino effect in housing, retail, and local tax revenue across the state. Number 8. Michigan. Michigan is practically fused with Canada, economically, geographically, and historically. The Ambassador Bridge connecting Detroit and Windsor carries over 25% of all U.S.-Canada trade. And Michigan exported $17.2 billion worth of goods to Canada in 2024. The majority of this was automotive parts and vehicles, including engines, transmissions, and steel. Over 280,000 jobs in Michigan depend on trade with Canada, with the automotive sector alone accounting for a major share of the state's GDP. Canada also acts as a key supplier of raw materials like aluminum and steel, essential for manufacturing plants in cities like Flint, Lansing, and Grand Rapids. A Canadian boycott would shatter the heart of Michigan's economy. With 37% of all automotive exports heading to Canada, automakers would face severe production backlogs. Supply chains would collapse. A study from the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business suggests that a boycott could trigger a 5.3% increase in unemployment, especially in blue-collar sectors. The economic damage could surpass $4.7 billion annually, with local governments losing hundreds of millions in tax revenue. In a state still recovering from the economic scars of the 2008 auto crisis, a Canadian boycott could reignite a deep recession. Detroit, in particular, could see poverty levels rise back above 40%, reversing years of fragile progress. Number 7. Illinois. Illinois may not border Canada, but it remains one of the most connected U.S. states to Canadian commerce. In 2024, the state exported over $8.3 billion worth of goods to Canada, including machinery, industrial chemicals, electronics, and processed foods. Chicago's status as a national transportation hub means that a significant portion of Canadian U.S. rail and trucking routes pass through Illinois. Canadian National Railway and Canadian Pacific Kansas City both operate large freight hubs in the state, supporting tens of thousands of jobs. Approximately 95,000 Illinois workers are employed by Canadian-owned businesses or in sectors directly affected by Canada-U.S. trade. If Canada enacted a boycott, Illinois would experience chaos in its logistics and manufacturing sectors. A study from the Illinois Department of Commerce found that nearly 60,000 jobs could be lost within the first year, with ripple effects slamming small businesses statewide. The state's GDP could shrink by 1.8%, while the Chicago region could see its shipping and freight activity drop by 25%. The agricultural sector, particularly corn and soybeans exported through Great Lakes ports, would face shipping bottlenecks and spoilage. Furthermore, union jobs tied to freight rail and construction could evaporate, sparking labor unrest. Illinois' financial stability is already precarious. A Canadian boycott would push it closer to a fiscal cliff. Number 6. Ohio. Ohio is often viewed as the bellwether state in American politics, but it's also a bellwether in U.S.-Canada trade. In 2024, Ohio exported over $12 billion in goods to Canada, including auto parts, rubber, plastics, electrical equipment, and steel. Canada accounts for approximately 43% of all Ohio exports, making it the state's most critical trading partner. The Cleveland Fed estimates that more than 220,000 jobs in Ohio are tied to cross-border commerce. Major corporations like Goodyear, Honda, and Procter & Gamble rely on Canadian suppliers and customers. And with Great Lakes shipping channels cutting through the region, Canadian ports are key to getting Ohio-made products to global markets. A Canadian boycott would be catastrophic. It would sever the flow of goods and raw materials into Ohio's industrial corridors. Plants would idle, workers would be laid off, and exports would pile up with no destination. Based on modeling from the Ohio Department of Development, such a disruption could cause a manufacturing sector contraction of 3.9%, with $3 billion in lost economic output. The Buckeye State could see its unemployment rate increase by 2.7%, primarily in cities like Toledo, Dayton, and Akron. And the blow wouldn't stop at manufacturing. Hospitality, logistics, and public infrastructure projects would all suffer from the downstream effects. Simply put, Ohio's economy would enter a deep freeze. Number 5. New York. New York may be best known for Wall Street and Broadway, but its trade relationship with Canada is enormous and dangerously underappreciated. In 2024, New York exported $17.5 billion worth of goods and services to Canada, making it the second largest foreign trade partner for the state after China. Sectors most exposed include chemicals, electronics, agriculture, especially dairy and apples, and energy. But trade isn't the only connection. More than 850 Canadian-owned companies operate in New York, employing over 100,000 residents, mostly in finance, insurance, and real estate. A Canadian boycott would sever both economic and infrastructure arteries. Cross-border rail traffic via the St. Lawrence River corridor would plummet. The Peace Bridge and Lewiston-Queenston Bridge, key arteries in upstate New York, would lose over $3 billion annually in trade flow. According to the New York State Comptroller's Office, a total economic contraction of $4.2 billion could occur in just the first year of a boycott. Unemployment in regions like Buffalo, Rochester, and Albany could rise by 2.3%, and agricultural sectors could lose 35 to 40% of their export markets. Even New York City's financial sector wouldn't be immune. Canadian investors hold over $27 billion in real estate assets in Manhattan alone. If those were withdrawn, it could trigger a property downturn. In short, New York's economy is deeply intertwined with Canada's, and cutting those ties could rip through the Empire State's fiscal foundation. Number 4. Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a manufacturing powerhouse with a strong presence in steel, chemicals, machinery, and food processing. And for decades, Canada has been the top buyer of Pennsylvania exports, accounting for over $13.2 billion in trade in 2024. Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Erie are hubs of industry that rely heavily on Canadian clients and suppliers. Moreover, Pennsylvania receives a significant amount of natural gas exports routed into Canadian provinces, creating an interdependence that spans energy and environmental sectors. Roughly 110,000 jobs in Pennsylvania are tied to Canadian trade, and many small and mid-sized manufacturers would be the first to collapse without it. If Canada enforced a boycott, Pennsylvania would face an industrial deceleration. The Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry warns of a 3.5% drop in GDP, translating to nearly $6.5 billion in lost output. Unemployment could surge by 2.9%, with the manufacturing-heavy towns of Allentown, Reading, and Scranton taking the biggest hits. Even the Port of Philadelphia would see a 25% reduction in cross-border shipping volume, affecting longshoremen, truck drivers, and warehouse employees. Additionally, Canadian tourists bring in hundreds of millions annually. Losing that spending would gut Pennsylvania's hospitality sector. The result? A deep statewide recession that could take years to recover from. Number 3. North Dakota. North Dakota may seem like a quiet, remote prairie state, but it's economically entangled with Canada more than almost any other. Bordering Manitoba and Saskatchewan, North Dakota's trade with Canada amounted to $6.4 billion in 2024, which is stunning considering its small population of under 800,000 people. Canada purchases over 82% of North Dakota's total exports, primarily crude oil, grains, and industrial machinery. The state also imports fertilizer and oil processing chemicals from Canada. Over 70,000 jobs in North Dakota, nearly 1 in every 10, are directly tied to this bilateral trade. A Canadian boycott would slam North Dakota like a hammer. The state's crude oil exports, already vulnerable due to fluctuating prices, would lose one of their largest international markets. Wheat and barley farmers would lose up to 50% of their customers, and oil field operations could shut down due to lack of Canadian input goods. According to North Dakota State University's Department of Agribusiness, the boycott could lead to a GDP drop of 4.6%, with job losses of over 20,000 in the first year alone. Towns like Minot, Williston, and Grand Forks could see local economies collapse almost entirely. Add to that the loss of cross-border workers and tourism, and North Dakota could fall into a deep economic depression, triggering emergency interventions from the federal government. Number 2. Alaska. Geographically isolated but strategically crucial, Alaska is deeply connected to Canada for survival and commerce. In fact, over 90% of Alaska's overland trade and logistics routes pass through Canada. Alaska exported around $1.1 billion in goods to Canada in 2024, with natural resources like fish, minerals, and energy products leading the charge. But beyond trade, Canada is essential to Alaska's physical accessibility. The Alaska Highway, built during World War II, passes through Canada and is the only drivable land route between the lower 48 states and Alaska. Tens of thousands of Alaskans rely on this corridor for food, fuel, and construction materials. If Canada initiated a full boycott and closed that highway to U.S. freight and travel, the impact would be catastrophic. Alaskan ports would be overwhelmed. Food prices could increase by up to 60%, and fuel shipments could be delayed by weeks. The University of Alaska Anchorage estimates a statewide economic contraction of 6.8%, the highest in the U.S., under a Canadian boycott scenario. Remote towns could run out of supplies. Tourism from Canadian travelers, who make up over 45% of Alaska's overland tourists, would evaporate. The state's $5 billion fishing industry would lose access to Canadian processing facilities and buyers. In short, a Canadian boycott wouldn't just disrupt Alaska, it would isolate it. Number 1. Vermont. Vermont, though small in size, is the most vulnerable U.S. state to a Canadian boycott. In 2024, Canada accounted for a staggering 79% of Vermont's total international trade, with over $3.9 billion in exports, mostly in dairy, forestry products, specialty manufacturing, and electrical equipment. Its northern border with Quebec is a lifeline, not just for commerce, but also for tourism, medical services, and cross-border employment. Roughly 1 in 6 jobs in Vermont, over 65,000 positions, depend directly on Canadian trade or tourism. Small towns like Newport and Darby rely almost entirely on cross-border shoppers and suppliers. A Canadian boycott would send Vermont into immediate crisis. Dairy farms would lose their top market, Canada, which buys over 40% of Vermont's cheese and milk exports. Lumber mills would shut down due to lack of cross-border raw material flow. According to the Vermont Economic Development Authority, the state could experience a GDP drop of 7.4%, the steepest in the country. Unemployment could double. Schools and local hospitals, often funded by cross-border commerce, would face budget cuts and closures. Tourism from Quebec, which brings in over $500 million annually, would vanish. Vermont's economy is simply too intertwined with Canada's to survive a full boycott. It wouldn't just collapse, it could become the first U.S. state to seek federal economic emergency status. And there you have it, 10 U.S. states that could collapse if Canada ever cuts ties. It's a reminder of just how connected and vulnerable we really are. If you found this eye-opening, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.